Photoshop offers several tools and commands that provide different ways to retouch parts of a photo or even remove objects from a scene. The Content-Aware Fill command lets you remove objects by filling an area of a photo with other detail in the image. Let's check it out. Content-Aware Fill always begins with a selection of the area that you want to fill with surrounding image detail. In this image, I want to remove the photographer from the scene. You can use any of the selection tools to make the initial selection. I'm going to use the Object Selection tool because I know that it'll do a good job with this particular subject. With this tool active, I will drag to define a rectangular marquee around the object. And you can see that the tool has done an excellent job sensing what the object is and creating a selection of it. With the selection active, I'm going to go to the Edit menu and choose Content-Aware Fill. In the Content-Aware Fill workspace, the selected area is on the left and the area that's being sampled to create the fill shows as a green overlay. To the right of this is the preview of the result. And on the far right is the control panel with the sampling area options and the fill and output settings. I'm going to zoom up on the preview a little bit so we can see what's happening. There's an obvious dark fringe here, and the color inside the fill is not really matching the dune behind it. And this is because the initial selection was very precise, and some of those darker edge pixels along the shape of the photographer are being factored into the result. So we can fix that by coming over to the lasso tool in the Content-Aware Fill toolbar. And then up in the options, you can see that there are choices to expand or contract the selection. I'm going to leave this set to the default of 10 pixels, and I'll choose to expand the selection. And here you can see how that selection has been expanded to incorporate more of the detail around the subject. And in the preview pane, the result is greatly improved. In the sampling area options, the default is set to auto, and this method will use content that is similar to the area that is immediately surrounding the selection, and this is generally the best option to start with. And as you can see for this particular image, it's doing a really good job. The rectangular method will sample from a rectangular area surrounding the selection. So when I click on that, notice that more of the trees are added to detail that is being sampled. And that is creating an error by introducing part of a tree into the result. If neither the auto or rectangular options are working, you can use custom, which allows you to define the area that is being sampled. So let's explore that. I'm going to come over to the toolbar and choose the sampling brush, and I'm just going to begin to paint over the dune area to define that as detail to use to create the fill. And we can see the result there. Let me come down and add in some of the background here. And we'll get some of the area where the photographer is standing as well as some of that background detail. And there we go. That's already doing a really good job there. You can use the sampling brush tool with any of the sampling area options to modify the area that is being sampled for the fill. If you have multiple layers in your file and you want the Content-Aware Fill to sample from all of the layers instead of just the active layer, you can do this by clicking on the Sample All Layers checkbox. Below the sampling area options, there are some additional fill settings that you can use. And if you mouse over each of these, a tooltip will appear explaining what they do and what types of situations where they might be useful. Down in the output settings, you can choose to output to the current layer, a new layer, or a duplicate layer. I'm going to leave this set to new layer, which is the default. And when you are satisfied with the result, you can click OK to apply the Content-Aware Fill, and this will then return you to the main Photoshop workspace. Or you can choose to click Apply, which will apply the Content-Aware Fill, but leave the Content-Aware Fill workspace open. This is very useful if there are additional areas that need to be filled. I'll click OK here, and then come up to the Select menu and choose Deselect. In the Layers panel, you can see the new layer that was created by the Content-Aware Fill. And if I turn the visibility of that layer off and then on, you can see that it's doing an excellent job at covering the detail in that part of the image. The spot healing brush in Photoshop is ideal for retouching and removing imperfections from your photos, such as image sensor dust spots, small distractions, or objectionable elements like power lines. With the right approach, it can also be used to remove other types of objects from an image. Let's check this out. I'm going to begin this project by making a copy of the background layer by choosing Layer, New, Layer via Copy. And the reason that I'm making a copy layer is so that I can apply the retouching in a non-destructive way and have it be separate from the background layer. This will allow me to easily make corrections if some aspect of the retouching needs to be redone. I'm going to double click on the zoom tool at the bottom of the tool panel, which is a nice shortcut for zooming up to 100%, and then I'll press down on the spacebar to get the grabber hand, and I just want to arrange this so I can see all of the reflection of the Washington Monument. I'll come over and get the Spot Healing Brush tool. And up in the options bar for this tool, you can see that there are three types of healing that we can apply. Content Aware is the default, and this is what I tend to use most often. It's a good choice if you are repairing areas that contain an element of a pattern, such as the rippled surface of the water in this photo. Proximity Match often works quite well if the surrounding areas are consistent in terms of color and detail. For now, I'm going to leave this set to Content Aware. And I'm going to resize my brush. You can see it here over the monument just above this goose. And I'm going to do that by using a shortcut of tapping on the right square bracket key several times to make the brush cursor larger. If I tapped on the left square bracket key, it would make it smaller. I'm going to remove this goose that is fast asleep here over the reflection. I don't need to define any area as a sample point to copy detail from like you do with some Photoshop retouching tools. I'm just brushing over it. And what the spot healing brush is doing is looking outside the area that I'm defining with the brush stroke to figure out the best way to blend that surrounding color and detail into the area I'm brushing over. And it has done a pretty good job. I'm just going to go over a couple of these areas again, just to smooth out any little imperfections that are drawing attention to themselves. There we go. That's looking good. All right, let's tackle another object removal in this image. I'm going to hold the spacebar down to get the grabber hand, and I'm going to arrange the image so I can see these two construction cranes in the distance. And let me zoom up one more level. I'll do that with a shortcut, Command plus on Mac or Control plus on Windows. So since the sky surrounding these cranes is relatively consistent in terms of color and detail, I'm going to try the proximity match method for this. And I'm going to keep my brush size the same here. It's at about 45 pixels. And I'm just going to brush over most of those cranes to see how well that works. And it's working pretty good. Let me actually come over part of that a little bit more. There we go. Now sometimes when you get closer to an area like the edge of the monument here, proximity match may not work as well. There we go. You can see that's where it sort of fails. So let me undo that, choose Command Z, and let me just set that back to Content Aware, and let me go over that again. There we go, a much better job. And now I'll take out the rest of this crane here that is near the monument, make my brush size a little bit smaller to have a little bit more control. All right, that's looking good. And let's take out the rest of this crane here. Now let me show you a trick that is sometimes useful with the spot healing brush. Oftentimes you need to tell Photoshop to not sample from a certain area. So what I'm going to do is get the lasso tool, and let me actually zoom up one more time, and I'm going to use the lasso to make a lasso selection of the base of that crane, but I'm going to exclude the building underneath. I'll tap J to go back to my spot healing brush tool, and now let's just go over this again. And you can see that that's doing a really good job there. Choose Command 0 or Control 0 on Windows to go back and fit the entire image on screen. And I'll just turn the top layer off and on a few times by clicking on its eye icon to evaluate how effective that retouching is. And I think it's actually working pretty well. There are several retouching tools in Photoshop that can be used to remove objects from an image. As we saw in this tutorial, for removing small or simple elements, the spot healing brush is very easy to use, and it does an excellent job. The healing brush in Photoshop offers more control than the spot healing brush because you can choose where to sample the image data from, which is often very important when you're removing objects from a scene. Let's check out how this tool works. In order to keep my retouching on a separate layer, I'm going to make a copy of the background layer by using the shortcut of Command-J on a Mac or Control-J on Windows. I'm also going to zoom in for a closer view by getting the zoom tool and clicking a few times in the image just so I can see this man in the background a little bit better. I'm going to come to the toolbar and get the healing brush tool. And the first thing I'm going to do is make my brush size a bit smaller by tapping a couple of times on the left bracket key on the keyboard. Next, I'm going to define an area where I want Photoshop to copy detail from by holding down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows. And I'm just going to click on the edge between this brush area and the sandy colored hillside. Option or Alt click there, and then come over, line this up, and just start painting in there to remove that person. And it's doing a pretty good job. In some cases, the fact that that person was so much darker than the area around it might have caused some problems, but I'll show you how to address those when we remove the person in the foreground. So, apropos that, let me hold down the space bar to get the grabber hand, and let me move the image over so we can see that person in the foreground. And let me make the brush size a little bit larger for the healing brush tool. I'll tap on the right bracket key several times to get a bigger brush. And I'm going to hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows and sample from the path. Clicking there to sample on the path. Then I'll bring this over, line up the path, and start painting over the person. And here you can see how the color from the person's blue jeans is bleeding through into the area that's being retouched. Because what the healing brush is doing is it is copying the detail, but it is preserving some of the color and brightness from the area that's being covered up. So that's not going to work here, so I'm going to undo that by choosing Command-Z or Control-Z. And let me show you an interesting little technique that can sometimes help with situations like this. I'm going to come over to the toolbar and get the brush tool. And with the brush tool active, I can hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows and get the eyedropper tool, and I can click to sample color from within the actual image. And that color is placed down here in the foreground color swatch in the bottom of the toolbar. And now with that color there, I can just paint that over the person here. And let me come over to the other side, Option click to sample some other color over here. And even though this looks, really bad and flat color, not photographic at all, when I come back over this with the healing brush tool, it's going to work out very well to make a much better blend where the color of that person's clothing is not coming through and bleeding through the image details that I am copying with the healing brush. So, that looks good for now. Let me switch to the healing brush. I'm going to tap J, and I'm going to Option or Alt click on the path again to copy that, come over, line this path up, and then just start bringing this over and copying good image detail over those areas where I have added actual color from the image. Make my healing brush a little bit smaller and come in here, Option click in some other areas just to make sure I'm not copying the same detail over and over again. And this is actually working out pretty well. Let's come down to the bottom part here and blend that in. And so you can see that this is a nice solution for those times when the healing brush wants to blend in color from the area you're covering up, but it's just not really working with the detail. Let me press Command-0 to go back and fit the image on screen, and that's looking pretty good. For retouching where you need the content-aware functionality of the spot healing brush, but you require more control over what parts of the image are sampled, the healing brush can often provide excellent retouching capabilities for removing objects from a photo. The clone stamp in Photoshop is the tool to use when you need to copy existing detail as accurately as possible in order to remove something from an image. In this photo, we'll use this tool to remove one of the people in the crosswalk. So when you're doing retouching or object removal in Photoshop, it's always a good idea to keep your retouching on a separate layer so that the changes are non-destructive to the underlying image. So over here in the Layers panel, I'm going to come down to the bottom and click on the Create New Layer button to add a new empty layer above the background. And I'll double click in its name, and let's just rename this layer and call it Retouching. I'm also going to click on the Lock Position button for this layer, and this will prevent the retouching layer from accidentally being moved and becoming unaligned with the background layer. I'm going to come over to the toolbar and I'm going to select the Clone Stamp tool. Now, in order to clone detail from the underlying image onto the new empty retouching layer, I have to make sure that up here in the options bar for the Clone Stamp tool that the sample is set to current and below. The default setting for this tool is current layer, but that wouldn't work here because the current layer is empty and has no detail on it. So let me set that back to current and below. Next, I'm going to zoom up to 100% using the shortcut of Command Option 0 on Mac or Control Alt 0 on Windows. I'll hold down the space bar to get the grabber hand so I can move the image around and see this person here near the bottom of the crosswalk. I'm going to make my Clone Stamp brush cursor a bit larger by tapping on the right bracket key several times. And now I'm going to define a sample point. I'm going to tell Photoshop where I want it to copy the detail from. So I'm going to move my cursor a little ways over from the woman in the crosswalk there. And I'm going to hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows. And I'm going to line up that crosshair there with the edge of the white stripe. And with the Option or Alt key down, I'm going to click to define that as the sample point. And as I move this over here, you can see that there's a preview within the cursor of the detail that's going to be copied. And that's actually very useful in this case because I can line it up with the existing crosswalk line there and then just click down and begin brushing that over there. And as I do that, take a look at that crosshair that is following me over to the right of my actual Clone Stamp brush cursor. This is telling me where the detail is being copied from. And it's always a good idea to pay attention to that because it's going to give you a preview of when it might be about to move on to an area that you don't want to copy. So, all right, there we go. That looks pretty good for now. So let's point out that in addition to removing that person there, I have also created some repeating details. So you can see those here with this line and this little angled line here are exact copies of those same elements over on the other side of the white stripe. And even some of these dark spots on the asphalt are exact copies. So I'm going to remove those. Let me just tap S to get back to the Clone Stamp tool. And I'm going to tap on the left bracket key a few times to make my brush cursor a bit smaller. And I'm just going to Option click on areas of the asphalt and remove those repeating details so that they are not there, drawing attention to themselves. Because the human eye and the human brain are very good at picking up patterns and noticing patterns and repeating details. So let me just do a little bit of that up here on this line in the crosswalk stripe. All right, there we go. That's looking better. But that's definitely always something you should keep in mind as you're using the Clone Stamp tool or indeed any of the retouching tools. I'm going to zoom out and fit the image on screen using the shortcut of Command 0 on Mac or Control 0 on Windows. And if I turn off the eye icon for the background layer, you can see that all of the retouching detail is now on this separate layer that I created at the beginning of the project. In terms of the details that are sampled and copied for retouching or removing objects, the Clone Stamp tool provides the most control, especially when image detail needs to be extended over the area where an object is being removed. The Patch tool in Photoshop has a lot in common with Content-Aware Fill and the Healing Brush. Let's see how we might use this tool to remove one of the horses in the background. I'm going to start off by making a copy of the background layer by choosing Command J on the Mac or Control J on Windows, and this is just so that I can keep the retouching from the Patch tool on a separate layer. Working with the patch tool always starts with a selection of the area that you want to patch. You can use any of the selection tools to create this, or you can also use the patch tool itself as a lasso for the first step. So let's come over here to the toolbar and choose the patch tool. And what I'm going to do is drag a loose lasso selection with the patch tool around this horse in the center background. Up in the options bar for the patch tool, I have two different methods that I could use, normal or content aware. I'm going to leave this set to normal for now. And in normal mode, you can choose to patch either the source or the destination. Let's start off with the destination. And what destination refers to is where you drag these selected pixels. So essentially, it's going to make a copy of these pixels and blend them in wherever you choose to move them. So let's drag this horse over to the right side here. And you can see that it's created a very convincing blend of moving that horse over there. I'm going to undo that by choosing Command Z or Control Z on Windows. And now let's set this to source. So what the source is referring to is what we started with, this selection here. And to create the patch, you drag this selection over to an area that has good detail. Let me drag it over here to the same area just because I have a lot of background detail over there. And something like that looks pretty good. That's not working as well as I would hope, mainly because there are some differences in the background that aren't lining up. And there's also some differences to the clarity of the details in the background and the brightness and the contrast of that area. And that's because these two horses, which are having an obvious disagreement, are kicking up quite a lot of dust in this area here between them. And that dust is obscuring the details in the background. It's also affecting the contrast and the brightness. So because of that, this area over here on the right is not really working as well as I would hope to create a good patch. So again, let me undo that. And I think I need to approach this in a different way. So I'm going to get rid of that selection. And what I'm going to do is use this detail between the dark brown horse and the lighter horse in the background as the patch. But I don't have enough room here to create the patch in one step, so I have to break it up into two steps. So let me make a selection of the back half of the horse. And I think I'm going to change the patch method to content aware. I think that's going to do a little bit better job. And let me drag this over here, and I'm going to make sure I line up the band of grasses there. Yeah, that's definitely working. Let's make another selection of the front half of the horse and drag it in the same place. Again, I'm going to make sure I line up that band of grasses there. All right, that's definitely something I can work with. However, since I was copying the same bit of detail twice, I do have some repeating elements showing up. So I'm going to fix those with the clone stamp tool. I will Option or Alt click to sample areas that I can then brush over and just obscure the fact that we do have these repeating details here in the background. And even these tufts of grass need to be adjusted a little bit. So it's always good to cast a discerning eye on the area that you have been retouching just to make sure that you don't have any areas where there are obvious repeating details. All right, I think that's going to work pretty well. Let's turn that retouching layer off and on there by clicking on its eye icon. So of the several retouching tools in Photoshop that you can use for removing objects from an image, which one you use will depend on the specific details in the image and the capabilities of the tool. As we saw in this project using the patch tool and the clone stamp, sometimes the best approach may be to use multiple retouching tools.